11 Golden Age Hollywood actors who died of lung cancer. The glamour of Hollywood's golden age came with a deadly price tag. Behind the dazzling spotlights, underneath the lavish premieres and fan magazine spreads, lurked a silent killer that claimed the lives of some of cinema's greatest icons. In an era when cigarettes were as much a part of the Hollywood image as tailored suits and evening gowns, when smoking on screen symbolized sophistication and sex appeal, the stars who made smoking look irresistible were themselves falling victim to its deadly consequences. Today we're looking at 13 legendary actors whose lives and careers were cut short by lung cancer and smoking-related illnesses. These weren't just statistics, they were cultural icons, whose talents shaped cinema history, whose performances still captivate us today, and whose lives ended in painful struggles against a disease directly connected to the very habit that had become part of their iconic images. From tough guys to leading ladies, from comedians to dramatic powerhouses, lung cancer claimed them all with equal ruthlessness. Their stories serve as powerful reminders of how thoroughly the tobacco industry infiltrated Hollywood's golden era and the terrible human cost of that partnership.
Well, if you don't want anything, beat it, and don't come back.
I won't forget you guys.
One, Humphrey Bogart, the icon who defined smoking cool. No actor is more closely associated with cigarettes than Humphrey Bogart. With his trademark trench coat, fedora, and ever-present cigarette, Bogart created an image of rugged sophistication that generations of men attempted to emulate. That iconic image, however, led directly to his premature death. He smoked like it was part of his character, because it was. Throughout his career, Bogart consumed between 4 and 5 packs a day, approximately 80 to 100 cigarettes daily. On film sets, directors often had to schedule around his constant smoking breaks, and the familiar sight of Bogart with a dangling cigarette became a central element of his screen persona. Bogey didn't just smoke in movies, he lived with a cigarette, recalled director John Huston. It wasn't an affectation, it was genuinely part of who he was. I don't think I ever saw him without a cigarette in hand or one freshly put out. This smoking-infused persona reached its apex in films like Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, and The Big Sleep, where his characters smoke almost continuously. The cigarette became as essential to his characterizations as his fedora or his distinctive speech patterns, a visual shorthand for the world-weary cynicism that defined so many of his roles. The consequences of this extraordinary habit became painfully apparent in 1956, when Bogart was diagnosed with esophageal cancer at age 56. The cancer quickly spread to his lungs, and despite radical surgery and experimental treatments, his condition deteriorated rapidly. During his final months, Bogart lost over 80 pounds, becoming a shadow of the commanding presence he had been on screen. Though he maintained his characteristic sardonic wit until near the end, the physical toll of his cancer was devastating. He died in January 1957, with his wife Lauren Bacall at his bedside. What makes Bogart's death particularly tragic is how thoroughly his identity had become intertwined with the very habit that killed him. The cigarette that had helped create his iconic image directly led to his premature death at 57, decades before he might otherwise have lived had he not been a smoker. The sad irony, noted film historian Robert Osborne, is that Bogart made smoking look so essential to being cool that countless men adopted the habit, trying to capture some of his magic. His influence extended beyond cinema to shape behavior, with deadly consequences for many who emulated him. Despite his relatively short life, Bogart's smoking-infused image remains one of cinema's most enduring icons, a bitter legacy for an actor whose real-life battle with cancer revealed the deadly truth behind Hollywood's glamorization of tobacco.
Well, after you've been making a lot of strenuous scenes, you like to sit back and enjoy a cool, mild, good-tasting cigarette. And that's just what Camels are. Mild and good-tasting, pack after pack.
2. John Wayne, the Duke's Final Surrender. John Wayne personified American toughness and resilience throughout his 5-decade career. On screen, the Duke seemed indestructible, taking on outlaws, wars, and wilderness with equal fortitude. Off-screen, however, Wayne faced a battle that even his legendary grit couldn't overcome: lung cancer caused by a lifetime of heavy smoking. He beat it once, it came back with a vengeance. Wayne's cigarette consumption was extraordinary, even by the standards of his era. He smoked 5 or more packs daily, over 100 cigarettes, for much of his adult life, often supplementing this massive intake with cigars. Directors frequently had to schedule around his smoking habits, and Wayne was rarely seen without a cigarette between takes. The consequences of this habit first became apparent in 1964 when Wayne was diagnosed with lung cancer at age 57. The treatment was drastic. Surgeons removed his entire left lung and several ribs. The operation was successful in removing the immediate cancer threat, but the loss of a lung severely compromised Wayne's physical capabilities, a significant challenge for an actor known for action-oriented roles. After the surgery, Duke couldn't do even a fraction of what he used to, recalled director Andrew McLaglen, who worked with Wayne on several post-surgery films. Simple things like walking upstairs or riding a horse for extended periods became incredibly difficult, but he pushed through it with characteristic determination, refusing to let audiences see his limitations. Despite this health crisis and doctors' urgent warnings, Wayne continued to smoke after his surgery, though he did reduce his consumption somewhat. This decision would ultimately prove fatal. By the late 1970s, cancer had returned, this time spreading throughout his body. Wayne's final film, The Shootist, 1976, featured him playing a gunfighter dying of cancer, an eerie parallel to his actual situation. By the time of the film's release, Wayne's health was deteriorating rapidly, though he maintained public appearances and refused to acknowledge the seriousness of his condition. John Wayne wasn't going to let anyone see him as weak, explained a close friend. He faced death the same way he faced everything, with his chin up and his shoulders back, even when he was in terrible pain. Wayne died on June 11, 1979, at age 72, having survived 15 years after his initial cancer diagnosis, an impressive testament to his physical resilience, given the severity of his condition and the limitation of having only one lung. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, but doctors confirmed it was metastasized from his original lung cancer, which had returned with devastating effect. In a final act of public service, Wayne's family authorized the establishment of the John Wayne Cancer Foundation after his death, dedicated to cancer research, education, and support. The foundation stands as a permanent reminder of the disease that claimed one of Hollywood's most enduring icons, and of the smoking habit that caused it. The Duke faced down every enemy except the one he invited into his lungs every day, reflected one colleague after his death. In the end, not even John Wayne was tough enough to beat the consequences of a lifetime of smoking.
That's my cigarette. Viceroy. For smooth taste, Viceroy's got it at both ends. Got the filter, got the blend.
3. Steve McQueen. When the King of Cool met cancer. Steve McQueen defined cool for a generation. With his anti-authoritarian attitude, intense physical presence, and minimalist acting style, McQueen created an image of authentic masculine toughness that influenced American culture far beyond cinema. But even the King of Cool wasn't immune to the consequences of his lifelong smoking habit. The King of Cool wasn't invincible after all. McQueen's relationship with cigarettes began in his troubled youth and intensified during his time in the Marines. By the peak of his Hollywood career, he was smoking at least 2 packs, 40-plus cigarettes, daily. Like many actors of his generation, McQueen incorporated smoking into his screen persona, using cigarettes to communicate his character's detachment and rebellious nature. Steve used cigarettes like punctuation marks, observed director Norman Jewison, who worked with McQueen on The Thomas Crown Affair. He could say more with the way he lit a cigarette or exhaled smoke than most actors could with a page of dialogue. It was part of his minimalist approach, communicating volumes through small, precise gestures. Off-screen, McQueen's relationship with cigarettes was less calculated and more compulsive. Friends reported that he smoked constantly between takes, during meals, and even while pursuing his passion for race car driving and motorcycles. The combination of tobacco smoke and racing fumes created a double exposure to carcinogens that would eventually prove deadly. In 1978, McQueen began experiencing persistent respiratory problems and a severe cough. Initially dismissing these symptoms as minor issues, he continued working and maintaining his physically active lifestyle. By early 1980, however, his condition had deteriorated to the point where he sought serious medical attention. The diagnosis was devastating: mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer of the lung lining. While this particular cancer is primarily associated with asbestos exposure, which McQueen likely experienced during his Marine service and while wearing fire-retardant racing suits, doctors confirmed that his heavy smoking significantly exacerbated his condition and accelerated the cancer's progression. With mesothelioma, smoking doesn't just add to the risk, it multiplies it, explained oncologist Dr. Karen Reynolds. McQueen's decades of heavy smoking created the perfect conditions for the asbestos-triggered cancer to develop and spread rapidly. It was a deadly combination. Facing a terminal diagnosis and given only months to live by American doctors, McQueen sought alternative treatments in Mexico after traditional U.S. medicine offered little hope. Despite some initially promising responses to these controversial therapies, his condition continued to worsen. In a final, desperate attempt to remove tumors from his neck and abdomen, McQueen underwent surgery in Mexico in November 1980. He died of cardiac arrest following the operation at just 50 years old. His legendary vitality extinguished decades before his time. What makes McQueen's death particularly tragic, notes film historian David Thompson, is that he embodied such physical capability and life force on screen. To see that vital presence diminished and ultimately destroyed by cancer created a powerful disconnect for fans who had come to see him as almost supernaturally resilient. McQueen's death from mesothelioma linked to smoking shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded his screen persona. The man who had performed his own stunts, raced professional-level cars and motorcycles, and created an archetype of cool unflappability was ultimately as vulnerable to cancer as anyone else who subjected their lungs to decades of tobacco smoke.
That's good. How are you coming along?
I'll be in Washington tomorrow afternoon. You were right about Rankin.
4. Edward G. Robinson, the tough guy's final scene. Edward G. Robinson created one of cinema's most enduring archetypes, the tough-talking gangster with a machine gun in one hand and a cigar in the other. Films like Little Caesar established a template for screen criminals that influences crime movies to this day. Off-screen, Robinson was actually a cultured art collector and gentle soul, but his smoking habit was every bit as intense as those of his on-screen tough guys. He chewed cigars and spat fire, but never quit the smoke. Though primarily associated with cigars in his gangster roles, Robinson was in reality a heavy cigarette smoker throughout his adult life. He consumed between 2 and 3 packs daily, 40 to 60 cigarettes, for decades, often smoking continuously during rehearsals, between takes, and during the extensive preparation he did for his roles. Eddie approached smoking the way he approached acting, with total commitment, recalled director Fritz Lang, who worked with Robinson on several films. He was methodical about it, lighting each cigarette with the same precision he brought to crafting a character. It was almost ritualistic. Unlike some stars who incorporated smoking into their screen persona, Robinson's relationship with tobacco was more private than public. While his characters often smoked cigars as power symbols, his personal cigarette habit was less performance-oriented, a genuine addiction rather than an element of his image. The consequences of this lifelong habit began to manifest in the early 1970s when Robinson was diagnosed with bladder cancer. While this specific cancer isn't the most commonly associated with smoking, medical evidence suggests a strong link, especially with the intensity and duration of Robinson's tobacco use. With Robinson's case, we have every reason to believe his bladder cancer was smoking-related, explains urological oncologist Dr. James Chen. Heavy smokers have up to 4 times the risk of bladder cancer compared to non-smokers, and given his history, it's highly likely the cancer began in his lungs or respiratory tract and metastasized to his bladder. What adds a particularly poignant note to Robinson's cancer battle is that it coincided with what many consider his finest performance. His role as the elderly Hyman Roth in The Godfather Part 2, 1974, was filmed when Robinson was already ill with cancer, though he kept his condition private from most of the cast and crew. He was clearly not well during filming, recalled Francis Ford Coppola, but he was such a consummate professional that he channeled whatever discomfort he was experiencing into his performance. The frailty you see in Hyman Roth was sadly not entirely acting. Robinson never saw his final performance on screen. He died on January 26, 1973, at age 79, just weeks before he was announced as a recipient of an honorary Academy Award for Lifetime Achievement, and a year before The Godfather Part 2 was released. The award was accepted posthumously by his widow, Jane Robinson. Robinson's bladder cancer, with its strong suspected connection to his lifelong smoking, adds a tragic coda to a magnificent career. The man who had played so many tough guys who died violently on screen ultimately faced a slower, more insidious end, claimed by the very habit that had been his constant companion throughout his 5 decades in Hollywood. There's a special irony to Robinson's fate, observes film historian David Thompson. The actor who helped create the image of the gangster who lives fast and dies in a hail of bullets actually had a much longer life, but one that was ultimately cut short by the mundane, everyday act of smoking that he shared with millions of less dramatic individuals.
Well, to make that commercial that says simply, now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke.
5. Yul Brynner, The King's Final Message. Yul Brynner created one of cinema's most striking and instantly recognizable images as the bald, authoritative King of Siam in The King and I, a role he performed an astonishing 4,625 times on stage and immortalized in the classic 1956 film. Yet behind the commanding presence and exotic appeal lurked a heavy smoking habit that would ultimately claim his life and inspire his most powerful final performance. He made bald sexy, then made cancer real. Throughout most of his adult life, Brynner was a dedicated smoker, consuming up to 5 packs a day, 100 cigarettes, during the height of his habit. Like many actors of his generation, he incorporated smoking into his personal style, the cigarette providing a dramatic accompaniment to his intense gaze and distinctive voice. Yul approached smoking with the same dramatic flair he brought to everything, recalled actress Deborah Kerr, his co-star in The King and I. The way he held a cigarette, the way he exhaled smoke, it was all part of the exotic, mysterious persona he cultivated. It was theatrical, but it was also a very real addiction. The consequences of this lifelong habit became apparent in 1983 when Brynner was diagnosed with lung cancer. The prognosis was grim, but Brynner approached his illness with characteristic intensity and determination. He immediately quit smoking, a decision he wished he had made decades earlier. What sets Brynner's cancer story apart from many of his contemporaries is what he chose to do with his remaining time. Rather than retreating from public view, he decided to use his illness and impending death as an opportunity to warn others about the dangers of smoking. In 1985, knowing he had just months to live, Brynner recorded a powerful anti-smoking public service announcement for the American Cancer Society. The message was simple but haunting. Now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke. If I could take back that smoking, we wouldn't be talking about any cancer. I'm convinced of that. The PSA was aired only after Brynner's death on October 10, 1985, creating an eerie and powerful effect, a message from beyond the grave from one of Hollywood's most commanding presences. The sight of the gaunt but still intense Brynner directly addressing viewers about the habit that had killed him became one of the most effective anti-smoking messages ever produced. Yul's final performance was his most important, said a representative of the American Cancer Society. That PSA reached millions of people and had a measurable impact on smoking cessation. He transformed his personal tragedy into a powerful warning that undoubtedly saved lives. Brynner's journey from heavy smoker to anti-tobacco advocate in his final months represents a unique legacy among Hollywood stars claimed by lung cancer. While his iconic performances, particularly as the King of Siam, ensure his artistic immortality, his final posthumous appearance warning against smoking may have been his most influential role. There was something extraordinarily powerful about seeing such a vital, masculine figure reduced by cancer, yet still maintaining his dignity and concern for others, observes cultural historian Neil Gabler. Brynner didn't just die from smoking, he transformed his death into a teaching moment that transcended his considerable artistic achievements. The fact that Brynner, who had made baldness sexy and exotic decades before it became fashionable, spent his final public moment warning about the unglamorous reality of smoking-induced cancer, represents a fitting final chapter for an actor whose career was defined by turning the unexpected into the unforgettable.
Where did you begin to play?
At home.
Yes, and how old were you at the time?
How was I? 4 years old.
6. Nat King Cole, the velvet voice silenced too soon. Nat King Cole possessed one of the most distinctive and beloved voices in American music history. His warm, velvety baritone gave life to classics like Unforgettable, Mona Lisa, and The Christmas Song, making him not just a musical icon, but a groundbreaking figure as the first African-American man to host his own television show. Yet the voice that brought joy to millions was silenced far too soon by lung cancer directly linked to his heavy smoking. He sang like a dream and smoked like a nightmare. Cole's relationship with cigarettes was both personal and professional. He was rarely seen without a cigarette, both on stage and off, smoking up to 3 packs daily, 60 cigarettes, throughout his adult life. For Cole, smoking was so integral to his performing routine that he would light a fresh cigarette between songs during recordings and live performances. Nat believed the cigarettes actually helped his voice, recalled Capitol Records producer Lee Gillette. He thought the smoke created that slight raspiness that gave his voice its distinctive quality. It was part of his creative process. A cigarette in the studio was as essential to him as having the right microphone. This belief that smoking enhanced his vocal instrument was tragically ironic, as the habit was silently destroying the very gift that had made him famous. By the early 1960s, Cole began experiencing respiratory problems and persistent hoarseness that affected his singing. Initially dismissing these symptoms as temporary issues, he maintained his grueling performance schedule and heavy smoking habit. By late 1964, the symptoms had become impossible to ignore. Cole collapsed during a performance at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas and was rushed to the hospital. Tests revealed advanced lung cancer that had already spread throughout his body. The diagnosis was terminal, a devastating blow for the 45-year-old performer at the height of his fame. When Nat got the diagnosis, it was a shock to everyone, said photographer and friend Phil Stern. He seemed so vital, so alive. The idea that someone with such life force could be dying was almost impossible to comprehend. Despite aggressive treatment, including cobalt therapy and surgery, Cole's condition deteriorated rapidly. He made his final recording sessions in June 1964, barely able to complete vocals for his last album, Love. Those present recalled how he would often have to stop recording to catch his breath or suppress coughing fits, yet the finished album betrays almost none of these difficulties, a testament to Cole's professionalism and determination. On February 15, 1965, Nat King Cole died at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, just 3 weeks after his 45th birthday. The music world lost one of its most distinctive voices decades before its time. Had Cole not been a smoker, he might well have continued recording and performing for another 30 or 40 years. The tragic brevity of Cole's life is underscored by his incredible productivity in the time he had. In just over 2 decades of recording, he produced nearly 700 songs and sold over 50 million records. The catalog he created in his shortened life remains a cornerstone of American popular music. What's particularly heartbreaking about Nat's death is imagining the music we never got to hear, reflects music historian Ted Gioia. Had he lived into the 1970s, 80s, and beyond, who knows what directions his artistry might have taken. The cigarettes that he thought enhanced his voice ultimately silenced it forever. Cole's death from lung cancer at such a young age serves as one of music history's starkest reminders of smoking's deadly potential. The velvet voice that defined sophisticated pop vocalism was extinguished by the very habit that had become an integral part of the singer's public image and creative process.
You know, I didn't really mind losing those courtroom battles, but I'm in a battle right now I don't want to lose at all.
7. William Tallman, the prosecutor's final verdict. William Tallman achieved television immortality as Hamilton Berger, the perpetually defeated prosecutor on the long-running series Perry Mason. For 9 seasons, viewers watched Tallman's character lose case after case to Raymond Burr's brilliant defense attorney. In real life, Tallman faced a far more serious opponent than Perry Mason, lung cancer directly caused by his lifetime of heavy smoking. He lost the battle on screen. He lost a bigger one in real life. Unlike many actors whose smoking remained a private habit, Tallman made his final battle with cancer intensely public, becoming the first actor to film an anti-smoking public service announcement while actively dying from the disease. This courageous final act transformed a reliable character actor into a pioneering advocate whose message continues to resonate decades after his death. Tallman had been a heavy smoker since his youth, consuming between 2 and 3 packs daily, 40 to 60 cigarettes, throughout most of his adult life. Like many of his generation, he viewed smoking as a normal, even sophisticated habit with few consequences beyond occasional coughing or shortness of breath. That perspective changed dramatically in January 1968, when Tallman was diagnosed with lung cancer at age 53. The diagnosis was terminal from the outset. The cancer had already spread to his brain, liver, and bones by the time it was discovered. Doctors gave him months rather than years to live. Rather than retreat into private suffering, Talman made an extraordinary decision. He approached the American Cancer Society about creating a public service announcement that would use his own impending death as a warning to others about the dangers of smoking. The resulting PSA, filmed when Talman was visibly ill and had just months to live, remains one of the most powerful anti-smoking messages ever created. Seated with his wife and children, a gaunt Talman looked directly into the camera and delivered a message of stark clarity. "I'm William Talman. You know, I've been the losing prosecutor on Perry Mason for the last 10 years. I've tried hundreds of fictional cases in that courtroom. But today, I'm asking for a verdict of real importance to me, and to you, and to your children. I've got lung cancer. A lot of people in show business have died of lung cancer, and they've been cigarette smokers. If you haven't smoked, don't start. If you do smoke, quit. Don't be a loser." The advertisement aired after Talman's death on August 30th, 1968, creating a powerful posthumous warning that reached millions of Americans. It was one of the first times a celebrity had used their own fatal illness to deliver an anti-smoking message, setting a precedent that others like Yul Brynner would later follow. Bill knew he was dying when he made that commercial, recalled his Perry Mason co-star Raymond Burr. He was in terrible pain, he was exhausted, but he was determined to use what time he had left to prevent others from suffering his fate. It was an act of remarkable courage and generosity. Talman's final performance, not as a fictional prosecutor, but as a dying man warning others, may have been his most impactful. The American Cancer Society reported a significant increase in calls to their smoking cessation hotline after the PSA began airing, suggesting that Talman's message reached people in a way that more clinical warnings had not. What made Talman's PSA so effective was its authenticity, explains public health communications expert Dr. Sarah Marshall. This wasn't an actor playing a role or a distant authority figure wagging a finger. This was a man literally dying from smoking, surrounded by the family who would soon lose him, delivering a message with the unique moral authority of someone facing their own mortality. William Talman's legal career on Perry Mason consisted entirely of losses, but his final real-life case, the case against smoking that he prosecuted with his dying breath, may have secured more convictions than Hamilton Berger ever managed against Perry Mason.
Oh, it's nice and warm.
Yeah.
8. William Powell, The Thin Man's Long Goodbye. William Powell epitomized sophisticated wit as Nick Charles in the Thin Man series, creating with Myrna Loy one of cinema's most beloved couples. His urbane charm and impeccable comic timing made him one of Hollywood's most reliable leading men for decades. Yet behind the elegant image lurked a heavy smoking habit that contributed significantly to the health issues that plagued his later years. He made banter look easy, even while coughing between takes. Powell's relationship with cigarettes was both personal and professional. On screen, his characters frequently smoked with the same elegant nonchalance they brought to mixing cocktails or delivering witty rejoinders. Off-screen, Powell was a dedicated smoker, consuming between 1 and 2 packs daily, 20 to 40 cigarettes, throughout most of his adult life. Bill smoked with the same grace he brought to everything, recalled director W.S. Van Dyke, who helmed several Thin Man films. It was part of his sophisticated image. The cigarette held just so. The smoke exhaled with perfect timing. But between takes, you'd sometimes hear him coughing violently when he thought no one was listening. This private struggle became public in 1938 when Powell was diagnosed with rectal cancer. While this initial cancer wasn't directly linked to his smoking, the extensive treatments he underwent, including experimental radiation therapy, took a severe toll on his overall health. Powell retreated from public life for nearly 3 years during his treatment and recovery. Though he returned to films in the 1940s, Powell's health remained fragile. He continued smoking despite his cancer history and increasingly frequent respiratory issues. By the 1950s, he was experiencing significant lung problems that many doctors attributed to his lifetime of smoking, compounded by the aggressive cancer treatments he had undergone years earlier. Powell retired from acting in 1955 at age 63, largely due to his deteriorating health. In the decades that followed, he battled a series of ailments, including emphysema and heart disease, both strongly linked to smoking. His final years were marked by increasing respiratory distress that severely limited his activities and quality of life. William was essentially housebound in his final decade, recalled close friend and occasional co-star Lauren Bacall. The man who had been so vibrant, so full of life and wit, could barely walk across a room without becoming winded. It was heartbreaking to see. Powell died on March 5, 1984, at the remarkable age of 91, an unusually long life for a heavy smoker with multiple health complications. The official cause of death was heart failure, but his medical records noted significant contributing factors, including emphysema and lingering effects from both his original cancer and subsequent health issues, many exacerbated by his smoking history. What's particularly poignant about Powell's case, notes film historian James Harvey, is how thoroughly smoking was integrated into his elegant screen persona. The cigarette was part of the sophisticated package he presented, along with the martini glass and witty repartee. It's painfully ironic that the habit that enhanced his image ultimately diminished his life quality so severely. Powell's longevity, despite his smoking and health issues, makes his case unusual among Hollywood's cigarette casualties. While he didn't die young like many smoking-addicted stars, the quality of his final decades was significantly compromised by respiratory problems linked directly to his tobacco use. William Powell's story reminds us that smoking's damage isn't always measured in years lost, observes pulmonologist Dr. Richard Canner. Sometimes it's measured in breath lost, in the simple ability to walk, talk, and enjoy life's pleasures without the constant struggle to breathe. Powell had quantity of life despite his smoking, but the quality of those later years was dramatically diminished.
He was radical, and I'm not. I'm sort of a half-assed conservative.
9. George C. Scott, Patton's final battle. George C. Scott brought an explosive intensity to every role he played, from his Academy Award-winning performance as General Patton to his work in films like Dr. Strangelove and The Hustler. His raspy voice and commanding presence made him one of America's most respected actors. That distinctive voice, however, was partly the product of the heavy smoking habit that would eventually contribute to his death. The voice of Patton came with a price. Scott began smoking in his youth and continued the habit throughout his adult life, typically consuming 2 to 3 packs daily, 40 to 60 cigarettes. His addiction was so strong that he would often insist on smoking during rehearsals and between takes, regardless of location or circumstances. George approached smoking with the same intensity he brought to his roles, recalled director Franklin Schaffner, who directed Scott and Patton. He wasn't casual about it. He attacked each cigarette like it was a scene he needed to conquer. It was compulsive, almost aggressive in its thoroughness. This aggressive approach to smoking took its toll over decades. By the 1980s, Scott was suffering from increasingly severe emphysema, a progressive lung disease that gradually destroys the air sacs in the lungs, making breathing more and more difficult. The condition is almost exclusively caused by smoking, and Scott's case was particularly severe due to his decades of heavy consumption. George's breathing problems became obvious during the filming of Taps in 1981, recalled co-star Timothy Hutton. There were scenes where he had to walk and talk simultaneously, and he would become noticeably short of breath. They started structuring his scenes so he could be seated as much as possible. Despite the clear evidence of smoking's damage to his health, Scott found it nearly impossible to quit. He made several attempts, sometimes achieving brief periods of abstinence, but always returned to cigarettes, a pattern common among heavily addicted smokers. George was under no illusions about what cigarettes were doing to him, said his fourth wife, actress Trish Van Devere. He could feel his lungs failing a little more each year. But the addiction was so powerful that even that awareness wasn't enough to make him stop permanently. By the 1990s, Scott required supplemental oxygen between performances and was limited in the roles he could accept due to his declining stamina. The man who had once commanded the screen with his physical presence and booming voice was increasingly constrained by his failing respiratory system. Scott died on September 22, 1999, at age 71, from a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. While this immediate cause of death wasn't directly smoking-related, his severe emphysema was listed as a significant contributing factor. Medical experts noted that the chronic coughing associated with his lung disease likely increased pressure on the already weakened aneurysm, potentially hastening its rupture. Scott's case illustrates how smoking can contribute to death even when it's not the direct cause, explains vascular surgeon Dr. Elena Martinez. His emphysema created chronic coughing that placed additional stress on his vascular system. It's like having a slow leak in your tire that eventually leads to a blowout. The smoking didn't cause the aneurysm, but it created conditions that made its rupture more likely. What makes Scott's smoking-related health struggles particularly poignant is how they affected the very instrument that had made him famous, his voice. The distinctive rasp that had become his trademark, initially enhanced by smoking, eventually deteriorated into labored breathing that limited his to deliver the powerful performances for which he was known. The tragic irony of George's case, notes theater director Peter Wood, who worked with Scott in his later years, is that the cigarettes that helped create his distinctive vocal quality eventually robbed him of the breath needed to fully utilize that voice. The very habit that contributed to his unique sound ultimately silenced it. Scott's battle with emphysema and its contribution to his death serves as a reminder that smoking's effects extend beyond the commonly discussed lung cancer risk. The progressive destruction of lung function that characterized his final years represents another, often overlooked consequence of long-term tobacco use.
Look, here's the mic, right here in the bush.
Yeah.
Now
10. Jean Hagen, singing in the Rain Star's Silent End. Jean Hagen created one of cinema's most memorably comic performances as Lena Lamont in Singin' in the Rain, playing a silent film star whose screechy, nasal voice threatens her career in the transition to talkies. The irony of Hagen's life is that the actress with the deliberately grating on-screen voice actually possessed a naturally melodious speaking voice, one that was ultimately silenced by throat and lung cancer directly linked to her lifetime of heavy smoking. The woman with the squeaky voice died whispering into an oxygen mask. Unlike many Hollywood smokers who incorporated cigarettes into their public image, Hagen's relationship with tobacco remained largely private. Off-screen, she was a dedicated smoker, typically consuming between 1 and 2 packs daily, 20 to 40 cigarettes, throughout her adult life. Jean smoked constantly between takes, recalled Stanley Donen, who co-directed Singin' in the Rain with Gene Kelly. It was such a contrast to see this elegant woman with the beautiful, natural voice deliberately speaking in that horrible Lena Lamont squeak for the camera, then immediately lighting up and reverting to her normal, refined tones as soon as we called cut. Hagen's performance as Lena Lamont earned her an Academy Award nomination and remains her most recognized role, though she delivered numerous other acclaimed performances in films like The Asphalt Jungle and television's Make Room for Daddy, later The Danny Thomas Show. Throughout her career, smoking remained her constant companion, a habit shared by many actors of her generation who viewed cigarettes as an almost mandatory accessory to the creative process. The consequences of this lifelong habit became apparent in the mid-1970s when Hagen was diagnosed with throat cancer, a disease strongly associated with smoking. The location was cruelly ironic for an actress whose natural speaking voice had been one of her underappreciated assets. It was heartbreaking to see Jean lose her voice, recalled actor and friend Keenan Wynn. This woman who had such a naturally beautiful speaking voice, far lovelier than audiences who only knew her as Lena Lamont would ever realize, was reduced to whispering and eventually communicating through notes. The cruelty of that particular cancer targeting her throat wasn't lost on anyone who knew her. As is common with smoking-related cancers, Hagen's initial throat cancer eventually spread to her lungs, creating a two-front battle against the disease. Despite aggressive treatment, her condition deteriorated rapidly throughout 1977. The woman who had once brought so much laughter to audiences suffered tremendously in her final months. Hagen died on August 29, 1977, at the relatively young age of 54. Her premature death cut short a career that had already demonstrated remarkable range across comedy, drama, film, and television. Had she lived, Hagen might have enjoyed another 2 or 3 decades of performing, potentially introducing her talents to entirely new generations of viewers. Jean Hagen's death represents one of Hollywood's great lost opportunities, reflects film historian Janine Basinger. She was an actress of extraordinary versatility who had barely reached middle age when cancer took her. The roles she might have played in her 60s, 70s, and beyond, character parts that often provide actresses with their richest opportunities, were all erased by her smoking-induced cancer. The cruel irony of Hagen's cancer targeting her throat, silencing the natural voice that had been deliberately disguised in her most famous role, adds an extra layer of tragedy to her premature death. The actress forever associated with a character whose voice was her downfall ultimately lost her own voice to the cigarettes she couldn't give up.
I guess he killed Alan and he tried to frame me.
11. Jack Cassidy, the fire he couldn't escape. Jack Cassidy possessed the looks, voice, and talent to become one of Hollywood's biggest stars, yet he remained primarily known for television guest roles and Broadway performances. With his matinee idol appearance and exceptional singing voice, Cassidy created memorable characters on stage and screen while establishing a show business dynasty through his sons David and Sean Cassidy. His promising career, however, was cut tragically short by a fire likely caused by the cigarettes he smoked incessantly. He lived fast, smoked faster, and died in a blaze he lit himself. Throughout his adult life, Cassidy was a dedicated smoker, typically consuming 2 to 3 packs daily, 40 to 60 cigarettes. This habit intensified during periods of stress and while drinking, another chronic issue that plagued the actor throughout his career. Jack lived with a cigarette in his hand, recalled actress Shirley Jones, his first wife and mother of his son Sean. He smoked constantly, during rehearsals, between scenes, while learning lines, even while eating meals. It was as much a part of him as his voice or his smile. This constant smoking, combined with increasingly heavy alcohol consumption, created a dangerous pattern of behavior. Friends reported that the intoxicated Cassidy would often fall asleep with lit cigarettes, a habit that resulted in numerous small fires and close calls in the years leading up to his death. We were always finding burn marks on his clothing, furniture, even his bed linens, remembered David Cassidy, Jack's son from his first marriage. He'd laugh it off, but those of us who cared about him were terrified that someday he wouldn't wake up in time. That fear became reality in the early morning hours of December 12th, 1976. After returning to his penthouse apartment in West Hollywood following a night of drinking, the 49-year-old Cassidy apparently fell asleep on his couch with a lit cigarette. The resulting fire spread rapidly, engulfing the apartment in flames. Firefighters responding to the blaze found Cassidy's body near the front door, suggesting he had awakened and attempted to escape before being overcome by smoke inhalation. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation due to carbon monoxide poisoning, with severe burns over much of his body. The Los Angeles County coroner's investigation concluded that the fire had almost certainly been ignited by a cigarette, though the extensive damage to the apartment made it impossible to determine with absolute certainty. What was clear from the evidence, however, was that Cassidy had been heavily intoxicated at the time of the fire, with a blood alcohol level well above the legal limit. Jack's death was particularly tragic because it was so preventable, notes fire safety expert Robert Williams. It represented the deadly culmination of 2 destructive habits, smoking and drinking, that had been on a collision course for years. The cigarette may have started the fire, but it was the combination of tobacco and alcohol that truly killed him. What makes Cassidy's death especially poignant is that it came at a time when his career appeared to be entering a promising new phase. Despite struggles with typecasting and the challenge of transitioning from Broadway to Hollywood, Cassidy had established himself as a memorable television villain through guest appearances on shows like Columbo and Mission Impossible. He was just beginning to explore more complex dramatic roles that might have led to the film career that had previously eluded him. Jack was finally breaking free of the musical theater lightweight image that had limited his opportunities in Hollywood, explains entertainment journalist Tom Carson. His performances as villains revealed depths and darkness that suggested he could have had a fascinating second act as a character actor, perhaps following a trajectory similar to what Christopher Plummer experienced later in his career. Instead, Cassidy's life and potential were literally consumed by flames, ignited by the cigarette addiction he had never managed to control. His death at 49 left behind grieving family members, including sons who would continue the Cassidy entertainment legacy, and fans who would never see what might have been accomplished in the second half of his career. The terrible irony of Jack's death, reflects Carson, is that fire was an apt metaphor for how he lived, bright, intense, consuming everything around him. He burned at both ends of the candle, and ultimately that same fire consumed him through the cigarettes he couldn't give up even when sleeping.